Welcome back, everybody. Today's lesson is part 2 of basic camera settings. Last time we started the first segment, which covered exposure compensation and ISO, and you can watch that video lesson by clicking on the link in the description below. In today's segment, we are going to introduce camera modes, and we will begin by covering P mode and TV or S mode. Now, each camera is slightly different than the other, but we are going to talk about the main functions that most DSLR or mirrorless cameras have. Other camera functions are usually camera dependent, but we will talk more about those briefly during part 3 of this segment, so be sure to check out that video as well. So, what are camera modes? Well, all cameras have modes. However, some modes are more limited than others. For example, action cameras usually have a fixed aperture, which means that you cannot change the f-stop number. This limits users a bit in terms of adjusting brightness and their depth of field. However, if you can understand each mode and what function it provides, you can then start to adjust your settings to compensate that fixed aperture size. And so these modes that I'm talking about, you can always find them on your camera settings or on your camera's mode dial. So what is a mode dial then? Well, most DSLRs have a mode dial. Most modern cameras also have digital options that you can usually access through an LCD screen. Each mode allows users to take control over specific functions of their camera. However, most of these functions are relatively the same. It all depends on your specific type of camera, because some cameras are limited, and that's just one factor that plays into why some cameras are more expensive than the others. Now, the main modes that most cameras will have are as follows. Most all DSLR or mirrorless cameras will have 4 main modes that you can choose from, and so that's why these are the modes that we're going to talk about the most, which is programmed auto mode, shutter speed priority, aperture priority, and manual mode. But which one of these should you select and why? Well, it all depends on a few things, so let's go ahead and talk about all of that. We're going to start with P mode, which is programmed auto mode, and then we're going to move on to TV or S mode, which is shutter speed priority. We will cover the other modes in part 3 of this lesson, so be sure to look out for that video as well. Now, P mode is basically auto mode with a few minor differences, so let's go ahead and talk about auto mode first, and then we'll get into P mode. So what is auto mode? Well, auto mode chooses the settings for you. Auto mode is a great place to hang out if you're a beginner or are new to photography. If someone who might not know too much about cameras were to ask you if they could borrow your camera one day, and you actually said yes, you would probably want to put it in auto mode first before lending it out to them. This function tells the camera to make all the exposure choices itself, and so that means your camera will make all the decisions on its own as to what f-stop number, shutter speed, and ISO will be best suited to the current scene that you're photographing. All cameras have this feature, and so if you're shooting on a cell phone, which most people do, then you're probably already shooting in auto mode. That's why lending out your DSLR or mirrorless camera to somebody is probably not a good idea, especially if they don't know how to manipulate the camera's functions, but the easiest way to fix that is simply by putting it in auto mode for them. You cannot adjust anything once you're in auto mode. The camera makes all the choices for you. However, when you're in P mode, you will gain a bit more control over the camera's settings. So why would you want to use this mode? If you're a beginner or don't have the time to mess with the settings, you could spin your mode dial to auto mode and make things much easier for you. Because sometimes simply taking the photo in the moment is what matters most, not necessarily all those settings. You cannot adjust the settings while in auto mode, but you do have some control in P mode, and so let's go ahead and talk about that. So what is P mode? Well, P mode, or programmed auto mode, is a function that tells the camera to choose the aperture and shutter speed for you, and it usually does an okay job at optimizing the exposure for your current scene. Unlike auto mode, when you are in P mode, you will have more control over the ISO and exposure compensation. So if you're shooting at night and your camera is not selecting the right ISO for you, you can go in and adjust it yourself. Why would you want to use this function? If you have a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera and you plan on learning how to take control over your settings one day, then I highly suggest that you start using P mode and choosing that over auto mode. And here's why. Putting yourself in a situation where you are held accountable for making a few minor adjustments on your own, it forces you to gain some practice. So if you give yourself some responsibility in the process of taking photos or videos, you will gain experience much faster than doing it only in auto mode. This goes for your cell phones too, so if you have a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you should be using that instead of your cell phone. You want to do this so that you will gain as much experience as possible. So how can you adjust P mode? Well, again, you have control over the ISO and exposure compensation when you're shooting in P mode, and to access those functions of your specific camera, you should refer to your user manual, but you can also check out part 1 of this lesson, which covers ISO and exposure compensation. So what is TV or S mode, and why do I keep saying or S mode? Well, spinning your dial to TV or S puts your camera in shutter speed priority. TV stands for time value, which is based on the time it takes for your shutter to release, and S stands for shutter speed. Shutter speed priority is a mode that tells your camera to take control of selecting the proper aperture size for the current scene, and this allows you as the user to be in full control of the shutter speed. You are also in control of the ISO and exposure compensation, but why should you use this function? Other than adjusting exposure itself, you do have a couple other reasons why you would want to choose this mode, so let's go ahead and talk about those. First, let's talk about using your shutter speed as part of controlling the exposure. We're going to recap on the exposure triangle, which is from part 1 of this lesson, and if you recall, adjusting any one side of the exposure triangle will require at least one other side to be adjusted as well. By looking at the exposure triangle, you can see that when you increase your shutter speed, you will also affect the duration of light as well as the motion blur. For instance, when you increase your shutter speed, you are reducing the amount of light that can enter your camera's sensor, but when you slow down your shutter speed, you allow more light to enter your camera. This is the same with motion blur, so as you reduce your shutter speed, you are actually increasing the amount of motion blur that's going to be in your photos and videos. Remember, light determines the exposure, so even though ISO, shutter speed, and aperture manages that light as it enters your camera's sensor, you too can manage that light source as well. Once you master exposure, you will increase the quality of your photos and videos tenfold. Another reason why you might want to choose shutter speed priority is to capture or avoid motion blur. But what is motion blur? Motion blur equals captured motion within a photo or video. In photos, motion blur appears as a blurry streak that is only present during physical motion. Motion blur is caused by moving objects other than the camera itself. So when do you want to capture motion blur? Well, it really depends on what you're shooting and what conditions you're shooting in. For instance, in cinematography, filmmakers shoot their videos with their shutter speed set double to their frame rate. What this does is it matches natural motion. For example, our eyes, they see life at roughly 24 frames per second. And so if our eyes also had a shutter speed, that would be set to about 1/50th of a second, which is double that frame rate. However, photographers might want to capture or freeze that motion in their photos instead. And so, for instance, photographing birds usually requires a faster shutter speed, whereas shooting sporting events or other creative things like light painting, you might want to capture that blurry motion. For example, if you take a photo of a hummingbird with a lower shutter speed, you will see its wings as a blurry mess of motion. However, if you increase your shutter speed and then take a photo of that same hummingbird, you'll start to be able to see the wings more clearly without any of that motion blur. So why would you want that motion blur again? Maybe you want to create waterfalls that have a smooth and silky appearance, or maybe you want to capture the clouds moving, which would also create that smooth look. Sporting events are another great time to capture motion, and of course my favorite is light painting, which is where light moves across the frame while the shutter is completely open, and that photo will capture that motion, and it actually looks pretty cool. This is how you capture light trails on vehicles, which is something we covered in my lighting video, and that link will also be listed in the description below. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about shutter speed priority. When you're using TV or S mode, how do you actually adjust your shutter speed? Well, again, this is usually camera specific, but essentially you should have either a physical dial on the body of your camera that you can adjust physically, or there could be some slider arrows within your settings on your LCD screen and you can adjust those digitally. I'm willing to bet that you have both options, and I bet too that you can choose which dial specifically on your camera that you want to be designated for your shutter speed. You'll have to refer to your owner's manual to reference which dials on your camera do what specific functions, but you can check that out and program them to your own liking. So what do the numbers or fractions stand for? Well, we'll save all the math for later as it can be overwhelming for beginners, but you do need to understand that shutter speed is calculated as a fraction of a second. For instance, shooting at a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second means that you're shooting 60 times faster than a single calculated second. You can set your shutter speed to be much faster than that, like 1/1000th of a second, but according to the exposure triangle, you would make your photos very dark that way, and you would have to adjust other settings to compensate it. You can also slow down your shutter speed to last a lot longer than just 1 second, and it all depends on your camera and the options it has, but this is where we start creating that motion blur. Now, there is always much more to learn about these topics, but for now I think this is a good way to get started for beginners. We're going to cover the other two main modes in the next lesson, so be sure to check out that video. Also, if you're interested, you can download this presentation at my Teachers Pay Teachers store, which is linked in the description below. If you're feeling generous today, do consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Tap on the notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos, and you can share to anybody who's willing to learn, colleagues, students, friends, and family. Hope y'all have a great week, and I'll see y'all in the next one.